So domain-driven design is a one way of doing domain modeling, which is focused on domain. The domain is the most important thing. The concepts in the domain, the words that people use, the mental models that people have, that is much more important than what the database schema is, or what the class hierarchy is, or those kinds of things. So
Are
yeah.
you saying that the database isn't the center of the universe?
It is the center of the universe.
We're live. Hi. Yeah. So today we have a special guest, um, Scott Wlaschin. Um, I don't know, Scott. Are you going now? Okay, I have to start calling you Bizmonger so that the names don't clash.
That's either Bismonger or Nimrod. It doesn't matter.
All
Well, I
right,
guess my thing
let's.
says Bismonger, so sure. Okay.
Okay, so let's go Bizmonger. Can you introduce Scott Wlaschin?
Sure. So I don't have his bio in front of me, but I will say that I met Scott personally in London approximately maybe 7 years ago, maybe.
Yep.
And my agenda was to go to, I thought it was NDC London conference. And I was like, I'm going to meet the guy that answers 70% of my F sharp questions as I'm trying to onboard, which is Mark Seaman. And I'm going to meet Scott Wlaschin, the videos on YouTube that I consume. And that was my agenda. So I spent my own money. I spent like $4,500 between the flight, hotel, and the conference ticket to meet those two people. And yeah, I felt like a groupie. I remember approaching Scott Wlaschin in the darkly lit auditorium, and he made small talk with me for a couple minutes, and then I gave him his space. That's how I met him. But Scott Wlaschin, you are the author of F Sharp for Fun and Profit. You are the author of Domain Modeling Made Functional, and you are a consistent conference speaker at conferences such as NDC, as well as, I don't know, the other conferences that you may be featured in, but you tend to focus on uh, the F Sharp program. Well, really not, it's F Sharp, but really functional programming. And you help demystify what people like myself believe are complex, and you kind of distill it down. As well as the other part that I'm missing is, yeah, someone tell
domain,
me in.
domain modeling, the domain modeling side of
Domain
things.
modeling. Thank
Yeah.
you. So that book was published approximately 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I read it, consumed it, and then I kind of built on top of it what kind of works for me at the moment. But yeah, I'll just step back. And if you wanted to introduce yourself or anything that I missed or you wanted to correct, please feel free.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. It's great to see you guys. Yeah, I've been doing programming for a long time, a long time. And yeah, I've done all sorts of programming, including a lot of small talk, a lot of object-oriented programming. And then I got into functional programming in F Sharp, and then I got into domain modeling and stuff. So I've done all sorts of things. And yeah, I'm a great believer in trying to make things easy and demystify things. And I think there's people like to programmers. Some programmers like to make things kind of overly complicated, and I don't think there's no reason why they need to be complicated. They're just tools, and if you can't explain something simply, then almost everything can be explained simply. So I'm a great believer in trying to get people on board, and in welcoming people to the technology and not kind of gatekeeping. So yeah.
You have a video that I will say is one of my favorite videos on software development. The video is titled, I believe it's Designing with Capabilities.
Oh yeah, that's an unusual one. That's one of my favorites too, actually.
Yeah, it's the way that you explain the design concept is very simple, and yet I was still embarrassed that I've never practiced it before I consumed your video. So just very briefly, yeah.
Yeah, that's an unusual one. I mean, I actually like that a lot, but I think it's not a very common approach to doing software design.
Odie, is there anything you wanted to share before we read one of the comments from our previous videos?
Yeah. I wanted to also add that I'm also a big fan as well. of Scott Wlaschin.
Mhm.
I remember reading your book, reading both domain modeling made functional, and even uh, the F sharp for fun and profit made into an ebook as well. So
Yeah,
yeah, that was my preferred way of reading it. But
sure.
one thing I know I really do appreciate is your videos as well. The way you explain things, for two reasons. The first is the fact that you are using like F sharp and .NET, and you are using simple things that a regular C sharp developer like myself could easily understand, right? Using the APIs we could understand to explain functional concepts. And there was also the fact that the way you explain things, right? You try to avoid like, big words like monads and all
Right.
those monoids and
Mhm.
category theory and all those complications and all of that. So coming from, C sharp, which is what I did C sharp for a very long time. I was even about to quit .NET altogether until I now came around and, met functional programming. And all of a sudden I was like, wow. So, these ideas have been available all this while, and I was never exposed to them. So yeah, it's really an honor having you
Oh,
on
thank
the
you.
podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, pleasure.
Okay, so let me read. Uh, it's actually two comments. One was the kind of the root comment, and then there was an interesting reply by another individual. These comments are from a reaction video that we did on the title. If I could try to scan up here, was functional programming is no better than OOP, and I think that's Dave Farley, if I'm saying the name correctly.
Yeah.
And I think there were probably several reaction videos created due to Dave Farley's video on that topic. So let me just read the initial comment and the reply from another individual on that comment. And I would like to get Odie and Scott's I don't know, feedback on it. So this comment is from, I can never pronounce any of these internet handle names. M- Muchins. Muchins from 2 weeks ago. And he states or comments, if functional programming were better, things like Linux, operating systems, databases, browsers, games would be written functionally, but they aren't. They are imperative and often object oriented. Functional software may be cheaper to write and maintain, just as Python code is cheaper than C++, but they are not better in terms of speed and memory consumption. Okay. And then another individual replied to this comment thread by Muchins. His name is the Mahaniki. I'm not going to try to figure out his name. But it says that's what most FP programmers don't see. They don't tell you speed doesn't matter because servers are fast. That's totally wrong. Big companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook replace these functional languages because they are too expensive to run on servers. A server running many requests per second costs millions to run. Those CPUs, GPUs use a lot of electricity. So adding more hardware to server infrastructure is damn expensive. Using faster languages makes it possible to use less hardware, which makes costs much more cheaper. I have heard many biases in this video. Okay. Well, I appreciate the responses. I know I'm pretty dogmatic at times, and I know that there's still time for me to change my bias or my opinions.
All right. Let me take
Let-
a stab at it.
okay.
So, um, I think it's important I first say something before. I think Scott probably has a better answer than I do, but yeah, I will say that this is a fallacy that many people in the FP also believe as well, in the sense that the speed or the uniqueness of a language is really what decides whether a language is used in an enterprise. I can tell you from experience that that is not true. More often than not, the cost of having developers working on a project the cost of hiring developers, the cost of getting people who understand a particular language or technology is far more than whatever they are paying on servers. Um, I have seen this happen so many times. In fact, I happen to be working in a funk company, and I can tell you that we do have like we do use functional languages, but at the end of the day, what teams, the choice behind teams picking a particular language has nothing to do with performance. It has nothing to do with uh, you know, language features, right? Is the language stable? Does it have good support? Are there developers that understand this language? How productive are the developers that they have on hand using that language? And that's why Facebook is still using PHP, right? That's why that's why many of the Google still uses Python for YouTube, right? You can't tell me that those languages are performant. You can't compare them to even F sharp. I remember during the video with Don Syme, I showed a graph in the video showing that when you're comparing performance, right? F sharp is orders of magnitude faster than PHP or JavaScript or Python. But those languages are still used. That tells you that it has nothing to do with performance. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Odie. It's 100% there with you because you're quite right. The languages, enterprises. Now, there are some situations where performance really is critical, like operating systems. But that original comment, operating systems aren't written with OO techniques either. They're written with all the, trying to work closely with the metal. But Rust, which is a very high performance language, uses a lot of techniques from functional programming. It doesn't really use object-oriented techniques. So you can probably write an operating system in Rust using functional programming techniques, and it would probably be very fast. So, but yeah, in general, I mean, and F sharp and C sharp are pretty much the same performance-wise, and a lot of big companies use C sharp, and they have quite Stack Overflow is a good example, and so there's a massive system there written in C sharp. They could totally rewrite it in F sharp. The reason they don't rewrite it in F sharp has got nothing to do with performance. It's as Odie says, it's to do with what skills you have in your team and support and all the other stuff. So I actually wrote a blog post called "Why F Sharp is the Best Enterprise Language," and my arguments were that the old school of object-oriented languages are not need to be updated. And if you look at Java and C Sharp, they're adding a lot of functional features because I think functional actually is faster than OO because there tends to be less indirection. The most expensive thing you can do in programming is garbage collection and memory indirection using lots of pointers with pointers with pointers with pointers and so on. And so from a performance point of view, if you get rid of that, well, the fewer of indirections you have, the faster it's going to be. And OO is full of lots of indirections. You have an object containing another object containing another object wrapped in an interface, wrapped in a proxy pattern, and especially all the patterns cause a lot of indirection. So I don't see that functional programming tends to strip away a lot of the kind of excess patterns and tends to be much more straightforward, which is why people like it. And so I don't see there's no reason why a functional programming, especially something like F sharp, which is sitting on the same uh, uh, framework as C sharp, there's no reason why performance can't be the same. And in fact, there are some people in F sharp who are doing super, super high performance stuff, like less than millisecond type performance in F sharp. If it's a bit of extra work, but you can totally do it. So yeah, I don't think that's a valid argument at all. I think the argument really for enterprises is again what is easy to support, and also what's easy to write, what's a fast turnaround time, how hard is the code to maintain. All these things are much, much more important to the average developer. So I personally think that with something like F sharp actually is faster to write and it is easier to maintain. But of course, it's hard to. There's a lot of inertia in the enterprise and corporate programming, so it's very hard to change people over. But you can see that just looking at what C Sharp and Java are doing, they obviously realize there's a demand sort of functional feature, so they're adding it into the languages. So there must be something there.
Yeah. Also, another thing I even wanted to mention is that at that scale that these enterprises are operating at, they have unique problems that are unique to them. So, for example, compatibility with their internal tools, right? Those things are huge deciders in whether they use a particular language or not. And I think that's one of the reasons why F Sharp has seen better. Has had better success in the enterprise over something like OCaml, for example, right? Not because the languages are so different, but because from a engineering standpoint, the cost of adopting F Sharp into an enterprise that already uses .NET is very low compared to using something like Haskell or Camel or even PHP for that matter.
Exactly. I had a project I was working on where we had to interface with a third-party cloud system, and they had existing APIs for Java and .NET, and in F Sharp I could just consume the .NET API really easily. And if I was using OCaml or I was using Haskell, it would be much harder. But also, if I was using Rust, it would also be harder too. So I mean, that's why I think F Sharp is actually really well placed as an enterprise language, because you can consume all the .NET libraries.
Okay. So we're talking about F sharp because of a comment that we read off. Again, repeating that you are the author of Domain Modeling Made Functional. Scott, what is domain modeling?
Right. So domain modeling is trying to capture the nouns and the verbs and the objects in the business domain and trying to capture it in code. And it's never going to be 100% because the code is always going to be a kind of an incorrect representation of reality. So this, what you leave in, what you leave out, but how do you transfer the knowledge about the real world into your code is what I would call domain modeling, capturing that knowledge. And it's actually a process. It's not just the end result. The process of actually talking to people, getting everyone in a room and going through, what do you mean by this word? What do you mean by this word? Uh, uh, and just trying to get everyone to agree on the vocabulary and the concepts, and then trying to kind of document that in the code.
Yeah,
Uh,
but
Very important concept.
Scott, aren't we already doing this? I mean, we do this in UML, and then we take these diagrams, and then we transfer it to code, and we're modeling real world systems.
That's right.
That's how we're supposed to design systems, right?
Right, absolutely. But I mean, UML. I mean, UML has the same goal. I mean, UML came from the same idea, which is that was back in the 1980s when you had the object modeling, but trying to capture the concepts in the business domain and model them in your code has always been an objective. And and before objects, there was other kinds of domain modeling before that. So it's always been a thing. Um, I think UML is just too complicated. You have to learn all the language. And so, I mean, I think boxes and arrows, everyone can understand the box and arrow. But I think in terms of actually, the problem with UML is it doesn't translate directly into code. So at some point, you're going to have to translate the thing. And also, UML is very tied to OO. It's got a lot of stuff about inheritance. And I mean, there's other things in UML as well. It's not just class diagrams and so on. But people associate UML object oriented. I guess you could totally have a functional UML thing, and maybe someone is working on that. But you can. What I like about the functional domain modeling is that you translate these things into a language which you can actually show people, and they can comment on it and give you feedback on it. So again, it's not just the process of writing it down; it's the process of learning and getting feedback. You say, "This is what I think it is," and then the domain experts will say, "Actually, you got something wrong. You need to tweak it. It really should be like this." And if you can get this feedback loop, chances are that your model will be pretty accurate. And so having it directly translated in code, I find is actually a much faster process than translating into diagrams and then translating the diagrams into code, because that's two steps. And there's the diagram to code, there's no feedback loop because you've already supposedly documented everything perfectly at that point. To me, the feedback loop of being able to get input from people who are the actual experts is really critical. And it's one of the problems with enterprise stuff in general is like you tend not to be able to talk to the actual experts. So but that's not a technical problem. That's a social problem, a business problem. where they try and hide the people who actually use the system, or the people who understand the system can't talk to the developers. If that's nothing to do with functional programming or object-oriented programming, that's to do with just businesses not understanding that if you want to build something, you need to understand what you're building before you build it. And if you don't understand if the developers don't understand what they're building, they're going to build something rubbish. No matter what technology they use, they can use the best programming language and the best, computers and the best whatever. If they don't understand what they're building, it's going to be the end result's going to be rubbish. So, yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yes. So in one of our previous videos, right, we discussed something a little bit along that line, right? And the analogy I gave was when the developers start to work on a project, they will make assumptions, and those assumptions, depending on how big the project is, those assumptions in the beginning might be inconsequential if the project is a small project. But if the project is sufficiently complex, you find out that those assumptions build on each other to the point where by the time the application is out, everybody is the domain expert is like, this is not what this application is supposed to do at all, or this application is producing absolutely rubbish inputs, and then there's the whole push for a rewrite and all of that stuff.
That's right. And at that point, often there's money, you've already spent all the money, and it's like, well, we can't afford to rewrite it. The users will just have to adjust to the software, and they have workarounds and all this stuff. And I feel sorry for the poor users. They're the people who have to suffer with this bad software that doesn't actually do what they want to do. So yeah, absolutely, getting the feedback as early in the process and as continuously is absolutely critical to a successful project. Yeah.
Yeah, so Odie and I discussed this in a video. I think the video was called like planning software projects or something to that effect. And we were on very like opposite sides. I think we still are. To make a long story short, in my experience, depending on how much a project costs, they want to see a plan, right? The more the project costs, the more stakeholders want to see how prepared you are by seeing diagrams, by seeing images.
Mm-hmm.
And so in regards to like UML, yeah, there's sequence diagrams that I think are still very helpful. However, I still believe, based on my personal experience, that there's pressure from up top that you go through the process of how you're going to construct this module or this system before you start writing code. And honestly, speaking for myself, I'm not sure how doing domain modeling, as in creating a whole bunch of types, as well as types that represent operations, right? How you can really share that with business stakeholders. I've attempted to, and because of the way that I practiced it, I was not successful, with emphasis on the way that I practiced it. And so I'm curious.
It's hard. I mean, I was saying it's a hard problem, and I don't think there's no like easy solution, because if it was an easy solution, then there wouldn't be any problem with. So it's very hard. But I mean, I can give you an example of something I did recently, a few years ago actually. I was working doing something for tax software. So it's like you have all these rules with tax. You make this, and it's like very complicated. And the good thing was that again, this was not a technical thing, but the fact that the person running the project got all the stakeholders in the room, the project manager, but also the experts from different teams, not just from one team, but actually from different teams. And we sat in the room, and I just asked them questions like, what is income? And they would say this thing, and someone else would say, actually, no, that's not right. And then they would actually start arguing with each other because even in the same company, they had different definitions of things. And so it was the process of them trying to decide. They were, I didn't know there's no right answer, but they have to agree on something. And they were using different words for the same thing. Sometimes they use the same word for two different things. Sometimes they use two different words for the same thing. It's very complicated because there were different teams working on different areas of the business, and just getting them to agree and fight and talk it through, that was the benefit. The benefit was not writing it down as code. The benefit was getting them on the same page. So that requires the management to think that way. Now, a lot of the times the management won't think that way. They say, I'll give you 5 minutes to talk to this person, and then 6 months later, I'll give you 5 minutes to talk to this person. That's not going to work. I mean, or you could try it, but it's not a good recipe for successful development. But in this case, they actually did get everyone in. I mean, we did 2 days, a 2-day session, and what was interesting is that the domain experts felt very, very positive at the end, because at the end of this process, they felt that the developers really understood what the problem was, because they'd been talking about it for 2 days nonstop, and we were just listening. So we weren't talking; we were listening. And that's an unusual thing for developers to do. So we were just listening to what they wanted and writing down what they said and saying, is this right? Is this right? Is this right? And at the end of the thing, they were, first of all, the experts gave the project a positive boost, because they were very happy that we'd been listening and that we really felt that we'd understand. And also they were happy with each other because they now understood this. One person said, I've been working in this company 20 years. I never realized we did it this way, because they'd never talked to somebody in another team, So getting everyone from different teams in the same room was super useful. So, and at the end of these it was only 2 days, so it wasn't like a 6-month thing. It was just 2 days. And at the end of the 2 days, I had, 10 pages of code, types and things with comments as well. It wasn't just the code, it was comments about how these things worked. And that was the output of that session. And that drove the rest of the project. And so, it was very successful. Now, this is actually an interesting example, because I think about 6 months into this project, they got a new CTO and a new CEO, and everything was cancelled. So it's, again, you can do the best development process in the world and it still doesn't work. But I was very happy with that development process, and I think that everyone else in the room was also very happy with it. There was a lot of people, when they come into a new project, people are always suspicious that they've had bad experiences before, where they've told people stuff and nobody's listened to them, and the wrong thing gets made, or so just listening to them and repeating back to them what they said and having it all been done, that made them feel much more positive about projects. So we got a little bit of I got a lot more support from the experts for the project because of that experience they had. So again, it's not that it was the process of doing it. It wasn't just writing it down. The end result was not the important thing. It was getting everyone in a room and talking to each other. What a concept! Just talking to each other made a big difference. And I think that's if you know about event storming, the same idea. You get everyone in the important thing about event storming is not the result of doing it. It's the fact that you've got everyone in a room from different teams talking to each other, and also one thing I found, and this is true both for my technique, where you write this. Basically, I write down the types and all that stuff on my computer, but it's projected onto the wall. So as I do it, people are seeing what I'm typing, and they say, "No, that's wrong. You made a mistake." And with event storming, of course, people are putting little post-its on the wall, but having it on a wall or on a screen actually makes the arguments a lot less nasty. Sometimes, and as a developers, you have an argument with another developer, and it's like, well, you're wrong and I'm right, and you have a big fight over something. But if it's on a wall, you're not arguing with the person; you're just arguing with the wall. You say, well, actually, that post-it note's in the wrong place, I think. And the other person, it's not a personal insult. It's like, well, I disagree. I think it's, but you can argue about where the post-it note goes or what the word to use in the code is. Without it, it just takes away a lot of the kind of personal interactions. So I think, again, that's another, having something that people can talk about rather than talk to each other can actually be helpful.
Would you say that event storming is a prerequisite to domain modeling?
I think it's very helpful because it's a much bigger picture. Domain modeling is very fine-grained because you're actually going down to the individual objects and the data structures and all this stuff. I think event storming is good to get a big picture of the whole business, of like what things are talking, So if you just pause for a second.
Hi, Odi here. I'm here to talk about this book, Domain Modeling Made Functional by Scott Wlaschin. I don't know, the reflection is kind of getting in the way. But yeah, that's it. Domain Modeling Made Functional tackles software complexity with domain-driven design. It's a wonderful book by Scott Wlaschin. Scott Wlaschin is an excellent educator, writer, and we are huge fans of his in the channel. And in order to commemorate his first appearance on the channel, we're giving away free copies of the book to 3 lucky viewers of the channel. In order to enter, go to the pinned comment below. You'll see a pinned comment below this video. Comment on the video. Tell us, what's your favorite Scott Wlaschin talk, or even just let us know what you thought about the episode. And that enters you for an opportunity to win a copy of the book. Even though it uses F-sharp examples, you don't need to know F-sharp or have any knowledge of functional programming to get into the book. It's a really good book. So we highly recommend it. We recommend it for software engineers, junior, senior, whatever level. We also recommend it for software architects, for business analysts, and just general IT leadership. Now, back to the show.
So, Scott, I've been in a similar. I participated in a similar activity where you have stakeholders from like different sides of the business or departments of the business, and they're going back and forth on what it means to perform a certain operation. And not only am I learning as a consultant or contractor or architect, but other parties that have been with the business for years, they're learning the different caveats. Um, and what I took from that, and I'm not sure if I'm off, is event storming based on my practice basically establishes the business policies of when the event occurs. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I just agree that what happens, this thing happens here in this team, and this, how does it affect the rest of the business? It triggers this process over here, which talks to somebody over here, and often most people are not aware of how the overall business. Most people just focus on their little bit of the business. They don't see how it fits into the bigger picture. Now, if it was a well-run, often. Really, ideally, a business, everyone should already know how the business works, ideally. But of course, in reality, people only. I mean, one of the things as a consultant is you're sort of brought in to sort of solve the problems a business has. If the business didn't have any problems, they wouldn't be bringing you in the first place. So you don't get to see, as a consultant, you don't get to see well-run businesses. You tend to only get to see businesses with issues because you tend to be brought in for that. So it's always it is often the first time that people have been brought together in the same room talking about things. So yeah, often it can be the development process can actually be a way to force the business to think about their business process in general and how they do things. The developers, because the developers are typically say, well, I need to know how you do things in order to translate that into code. And a lot of times nobody's actually ever asked those questions before. It's never been formally written down or documented or anything. So the developers typically are the people who force that kind of conversation to happen. And I mean, I can give you another example, which is when you install one of these big enterprise systems like SAP or or Salesforce or one of these things. The business, that often the CEO says, we got this new fantastic system. It's going to solve all our problems. We're going to install SAP, but what really happens is they have to then figure out how do they actually run the business. And before, again, the SAP people are going to be saying the same thing. Well, what do you want us to do? It's like, when this thing happens, what should we do? And so the hardest part in my experience of installing one of these enterprise systems is those discussions. What should you actually do in each situation? And event storming is a great way to flush that. And event storming is, like I say, even if you were doing like a third party system like Salesforce or SAP or something, it would be a very valuable part of the process to get everyone on the same page. So a good business would do this before you start buying in some third party consultant. But typically that's what our role is.
I also wanted to add something as well. I think there is some element of truth to what you said, in the sense that most times businesses don't have these things written down because at least so the way I see it is that's part of business in and of itself, because most times the people driving the business have deadlines, they have targets, they are trying to move very quickly, and in the process of trying to move very quickly, a lot of disconnect happens, right? And yeah, so it's, in fact, I don't think that businesses who are so focused on organization and structure early on actually get to make it, right? It's usually the scrappy ones that are moving very quickly that get to then make it and then look back and say, oh, what mess have we done? And we need to bring everybody into the room and reorganize and all of that.
Right, and that's a typical growing. There's actually there's a great analogy with that, what they call pioneers, settlers, and town planners. So the first people who go somewhere, they're just making it up as they go along, and then as it gets more and more formalized, as the thing gets bigger and bigger, and at some point you need to start formalizing all the, which is annoying. It's like I don't like working in big companies like that, but I think it has to be done. That you have to formalize the interactions between the teams, and the processes have to be documented, and you have much more paperwork, and but yeah, so and yeah, software. Unfortunately, now pretty much every business is a software business. Like in the old days, you'd have paper forms, and you'd physically mail or post the forms from one team to another. And now, now it's all software. So, but the software ends up being the bottleneck for understanding how the business works. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so we discussed event sourcing as a tool for domain modeling, if that's accurate. Is there a difference, or what is the relationship between domain modeling and domain-driven design?
Good question. Good question. I think domain modeling is just the general process of trying to capture the business thing into code, or into something that can be turned into code. I think domain-driven design is a particular way of doing that. So you could have object-oriented domain modeling, and you can have domain modeling for COBOL or whatever it is back in the day. So domain-driven design is a way, and you have a classic way of doing it before. Traditionally, is database-driven design. So you have your domain. You try to capture the business domain in terms of tables. You immediately transferred it into tables and relationships between tables and indexes and all that stuff. So domain-driven design is a one way of doing domain modeling, which is focused on domain. The domain is the most important thing. The concepts in the domain, the words that people use, the mental models that people have, that is much more important than what the database schema is, or what the class hierarchy is, or those kinds of things. So
Are you are
yeah,
you saying that the database isn't the center of the universe?
it is the center of the universe. I mean, and I mean, the thing is that if you go, to be honest, the database people will say, well, it is the center. I mean, most data is older than the software. Like if you take a take a bank that's been around for 50 years, they probably have data on there which is 50 years old. Now the software that accesses that data may change, but almost certainly the data they have is really old. And yeah, I mean, they would argue that data is more important than software. So yeah, they might say you should be doing database-driven design because that's the data is the most important thing. Um, and I can see that point. I can see there's a point there, but I think for most businesses, I think the problem with database-driven design is that it's hard to communicate that. Third normal form and all this stuff. The average business person doesn't understand any of that stuff. And the thing about domain-driven design is you're using the same words that the business people use. You don't have to normalize things. You're just literally using the same words they use and then translating that into code. So I think in terms of having a more successful delivery of a project, I think that's more likely to be successful because you can get feedback. The developers then are talking to the experts using the same language. So I think that's more likely.
Yeah, so in my own experience, right, because I've also run into uh, people like that who think that the database is the center of the universe. My argument or my counter argument is usually if I was to export the database, right, and wipe all your applications and just give you the raw database, would you be able to still like run your business, right? Because there is so much that is encoded in the applications themselves, understanding knowledge that the database doesn't just capture. So
Yeah, and again, a good example of that is all this COBOL code that's out there, because the COBOL, um, again, you've got the data. They already have the data. They have the tables, but the COBOL code has business rules in it that nobody's written down, and they can't just get rid of it because nobody knows how it works. So yeah, so COBOL is actually the code. That is where a lot of the business value is actually in this old COBOL code that nobody understands how it works. So yeah, absolutely.
I could see someone such as a younger me saying, haven't we always been doing domain-driven design? I mean, we were bred to do object-oriented programming, to model real-world systems. Look at my classes. My class is the blueprint for this real-world object. Not only does it have state, but it has behavior that operates on that state, and it's all in one class. Um, how does this really deviate from what we've been doing?
Well, I mean, domain-driven design was originally an object-oriented idea. So the original domain-driven design book was using object-oriented, was using Java, it was using object-oriented languages. So there's nothing specific. There's, to my mind, there's nothing specific to domain-driven design, to whether it's functional programming or object-oriented programming or whatever. To me, the key thing is domain-driven design is about using the same words and the same mental models that the experts use. But so yeah, domain-driven design was originally object-oriented, and I think when I came along, I understood domain-driven design and I understood functional programming, and I think one of my contributions is like actually all the domain-driven design stuff can also be done in a functional way, um, and you can apply get the same benefits, but within the context of functional programming. So yeah, I don't see it as being specific to a particular programming paradigm. It's just it's an approach to again capturing the data. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the part that the younger me was missing is having intimate conversations with the domain experts, aka business stakeholders.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the same. When the younger me has also fallen into that same problem. I once worked on a project, and this is how I learned the hard way. Is I worked on a project, and we had a fantastic team of developers, and we're using fantastic language, but we didn't talk to the customers. So we built this thing, and it was a beautifully architected, beautifully designed, well coded, had unit tests, all this stuff very nicely. We had continuous integration with the Git, with the repository and stuff, and the customers hated it because we never talked to them. We never actually got any feedback from them. There was that feedback was completely missing in our development cycle, and that was so there's an example. We did everything right except talk to the customers, and that was a big mistake.
yeah, something else I will also add as well is, and I think that also speaks to the heart of why we have this channel in the first place, right? One of the first guests we had, Jamie Edwards, we were discussing with him as to why software projects fail and all of that. And something he mentioned that was very, very interesting was, incentives, right? And when you don't speak with, so there's the technical aspect, which is what we do as software engineers, but we have to understand that that technical aspect is it's an island in a much broader whole ecosystem of business experts, domain people, human beings, all interacting with each other. And one of the beautiful things about event storming that I wanted to bring up as well is when you bring experts like that and they put input into the system, their feedback is given. There is a sense of ownership that they take in that system, and that is very, very powerful by the time you finish building it for it to gain adoption, because those same business experts who were there at the beginning will now become your champions in pushing that software in the enterprise.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a really good. You want these people to be on your side, not your enemy, but your friends, and they start They again, and I said in my example, when you start listening to them, they start championing your projects. Like, yeah, these people understand what we're doing. It's very nice as in a change. So yeah, absolutely. Them being the champions and them having input and being a stakeholder, a proper stakeholder, not just a piece of paper. Absolutely, really valuable. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because
Hey,
it's one of those things that as developers we don't see, because all we are all about is just the code and
Exactly,
the classes, the objects, without
exactly,
realizing that those aspects are just as important.
exactly. Absolutely right. Yeah,
so
100%.
so Scott, earlier you mentioned or you referenced you have pioneers, you have settlers, and you have city planners, or
Hmm.
something to that effect.
Yeah. Hmm.
If we take that and we try to map it to software engineering, somewhere we have architecture, we have domain. I don't want to say domain modeling, but we have a domain-driven design,
Yeah.
right? Like, what is the parallel to that analogy that you referenced earlier, and how does that map to system architecture?
Well, again, it's to do with when you're just starting out and you're making things up. If you're a small company, you don't have formal processes, so you just make it up as you go along, and people just talk to each other if they have a problem, because there's only 5 people in the company or 10 people in the company. But when you have 10,000 people in the company, then yeah, you need to. That's when you get to the city planning stage, and everyone has to think. So uh, yeah, that it's just. I mean, yeah, and unfortunately, that's what it is in big companies. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my question that I failed initially is, it, how important is system architecture to a domain-driven design? Are are they coupled? Can they be completely decoupled?
I think that's a good question. I think in domain-driven design, there's a concept of a bounded context. So the idea is, rather than doing everything at once, like a big system is very big, and the idea is, you take, rather than doing everything at once, you take little pieces and you do those separately. And where the boundaries are for those pieces is really important. That's one of the first things you need to decide. And typically, the boundaries are where people use different words, different language. So if you have a sales team and you have a fulfillment team or a warehouse team, they probably use different words for the same thing, like a product, or a customer. So a sales person probably talks about customers, anyone they can sell to. The warehouse is a customer, is something they ship things to, and it's a different definition of a customer. So they're using the same word in different ways. So they're probably different contexts, different boundaries. So if I was building this system, I'd probably deal with the salespeople as one system and the warehouse as another system, and have them interact. But they're using different words, different concepts, so that you could build them as two different systems and have them talk to each other. And so, from an architectural point of view, I mean, in general, I don't think the architecture doesn't necessarily reflect, the implementation doesn't necessarily reflect, the concepts. But I think in practice, the implementation will follow these boundaries as well. So each subsystem can be built and deployed independently because they're using different words. You do a lot of communication within that subsystem and not very much communication between the subsystems. So where those boundaries are is actually a very good place to have the architectural boundaries as well. So if you're doing a service-oriented design, those would be two different services, rather than having a giant big system. So, but I mean, they could also be in a monolith. You could have a modular monolith. So, from an architectural point of view, they don't have to be separate systems, but that would be the boundaries within the system, whether it's a single monolith or whether it's a whole bunch of microservices or whatever. It's good to know where the boundaries are from a conceptual point of view, as well as from a technical point of view. And if they align, and again, going back to this Conway's law, which says uh, the software reflects the team organization. The organization of the business tends to be reflected in the software. So again, if you have a sales team and a warehouse team, they're probably going to be you're going to end up two different pieces of software to reflect their two different needs, and that's fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you violate that, you are going to learn the hard way.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Because by the time you get requirements from one team and it's conflicting with requirements from another team, slowly your software will start to reflect those differences between them.
Yeah, did actually work on a project where they tried to have one definition of a customer for the entire business. Like, what is a customer? and they try to have one customer, one definition, one table, database. And of course, every different team had their own things. The salespeople wanted all this stuff, and the other, and you end up with this massive definition, which didn't make sense to anybody. So in that case, yeah, it's better to have smaller definitions that make sense within each team, and not try and have one massive thing that covers everybody. That's just the recipe for disaster, I think.
Yeah, I think I have one last question, and then I'll let Odie just take the rest of it. Is domain modeling language agnostic?
Absolutely.
Okay. That's it.
But however, yes and no. I do think one of the nice things I like about especially a language like F# is that the code is readable by non-experts. So I can show them a little fragment of F# code, and that even a non-expert, a non-programmer, a domain expert, but not a programmer, they can look at this code and they can see mistakes in the code without, not super detailed code, but just the data structures and stuff. They can see that. Now, if you're using a language where it's much harder to get feedback from the domain experts, then that does make it hard. It does make it impossible, but it's harder, which is why people have UML diagrams and stuff, because it's like, But one of the things I really like F# is I can actually show people the code, and they can comment on the code even though they're not a programmer. So the language makes a difference in that sense, but the general principle of domain modeling is not language. The whole point is, again, having the process of talking to people, listening to people, discussing, agreeing on the words, agreeing on the concepts. That's nothing to do with a particular programming language.
Yeah, an analogy I normally give people as well is it's like comparing Markdown with HTML, right?
Right.
Ideally, they are kind of the same thing, but Markdown is something that even a non-programmer can look at and be like, okay, I get what this is.
Right.
This is a link. This is, a heading, as opposed to HTML that has all these tags and all those attributes and those complexities there.
Right.
So,
it's a very good analogy, because they end up with being the same thing in the end, but one is a lot easier. One is a lot easier for a non-programmer to understand. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good analogy. I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal that from you.
Yeah, no problem. So, my final question is, in your experience, right? How can you give us maybe anecdotes, war stories of situations where things were really, really bad, and applied some domain-driven design tenets, and what the outcome was?
Yeah. So there was a project that I was working on for a skincare company, and they had a database of they have recipes for the formulas for the skincare. They have to add a bit of this and a bit of this. It's kind of complicated. It's actually a very complicated domain, and I didn't know anything about it. They'd had another guy who was working on, who'd actually been. They wanted a piece of software to keep track of all the ingredients and all the recipes, and they'd had a previous project that'd been going on for about a year, and they hadn't made any progress. And the previous developer had a whole bunch of classes and a whole bunch of stuff, but they actually hadn't delivered anything useful. And so I took over this project, and the very first thing I did is sit down with the users of this project and ask them, what are these things? Let's start with one thing, like an ingredient. What's an ingredient? And so I went through this thing, and we took one area at a time, and I then built the software using what they told me, and I delivered it the next week. Just a little piece. It's also agile as well. So I delivered something next week, and we went over the code, and they said, no, that's actually wrong, and back and forth. And then next week I delivered something else. But every single week I was talking to the customers, and I was learning a lot about skincare formulations and all the different ingredients and how they work. And it's surprisingly complicated, because the recipes are different at different scales, and then they have regulations in the EU about what certain things have to have certain labeling, and you're not allowed to use this, and it's all very complicated. So I personally learned a lot about this, but because I learned all this stuff, I reflected it in the code base. I tried to anyway, and the product was actually very successful. I mean, the customer, the users were very happy with it.
Remember when I said that I was going to ask my last question, and then I'll give the platform to Odie? I'll take that back. Um, the compiler
Yeah.
and and automated tests. I referenced earlier that the video about designing with capabilities changed my software development practice. I think for the better. Is there a relationship, or do you think there is a relationship between the amount of automated tests that one writes, or is still required to write when they're performing domain-driven design? And let me try to qualify that. So I found in my personal practice that one, I have like these rich domain types, if that's a proper term or not. But a lot of the operations that are exposed, they require types that are qualified, right? So um, the compiler will not compile if it doesn't have a precise input that that basically reflects or that is analogous to a state machine. It
Right.
just won't do it. So in
Right.
theory, I've removed I removed the need for a certain amount or a certain set of automated tests or maybe unit tests because my compiler does the enforcement of it based on the logical types that I'm using or the preciseness of the types that I'm using. Would that be a fair statement that there is a
Yeah.
direct correlation between the amount of tests one needs to write versus or when they're using domain-driven design?
I would say so. I mean, if you capture the domain, in the domain, it's often true that two things that might represent as strings, like an email address and a phone number. You know, a programmer might represent them both as strings, but they have different concepts in the domain. So if you represent them as different types or classes in the codes, that actually represents the domain better. So you get better domain modeling, but also you end up getting more type safety because you can't accidentally mix these up in the code. So I would say, yeah, the better your domain modeling, chances are the fewer errors you're going to have in your code. And if you're using a typed language, then yeah, the compiler will stop you mixing up an email and a phone number by mistake. Um, you know, and even if you're using an untyped language, even just having these concepts be represented in the code is you're less likely to make silly mistakes like passing a string in, you know, to the wrong as a wrong parameter or something. You might not get a compiler error, you get a runtime error, but you'll be either way. The better your domain model, I think, the better your code will be in terms of correctness as well as easy to understand.
Okay.
the yeah, the way it processes in my brain is that you have like two sets of programs, right? You have the absolutely dynamic assembly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything is free game, and on
Right,
the other end you have fully formally verified SSL libraries, for
right,
example,
right,
that they've done scientific research to make sure that there are no loopholes and so on and
right.
so forth. And what tends to happen is that you have a slider, right? And in general, you want your slider to be moving towards this other side because
Mm-hmm.
the closer you get to this side, the less unpredictable behavior you're going to see.
Right,
And the closer you are to the assembly, the more unpredictable behavior you're going to see.
right.
So, for domain modeling, right, using types to restrict all those inputs and so on and so forth, is pushing applications towards the side of not having unpredictable behavior.
Right.
And in general, those, like, to put what you're saying, Bismonga, is that those programs require less tests because there are less unpredictable things that can happen. So
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, if you have a string, you can do anything to a string. You can reverse a string, and you can do. But if you have an email class, you can't reverse it. You can't. It's not a string, so you can't. All the things you can do are much more restricted. You have, as you say, there's less. There's less states. There's less possible things that can go wrong. Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. All
What do
right.
people need? What do people for people that are new to this? What are the first steps for them to explore or practice domain modeling? I think there's a book out there. It's pretty mature and it has some really positive ratings. It's Domain Modeling Made Functional.
Yeah.
by Scott Wlaschin. And there's another book that I also favor. Sorry, Scott, but
Yeah.
your book is really good. And there's also another book. It's not written in F sharp, but it's I think it's called
The Vernon Vaughan book.
reactive
Oh no.
domain.
Oh yes. I know the one. Yeah, the other functional one.
It's by
The very gosh.
Duvash.
Yeah.
I can't say his name.
Yeah.
Uh, it's here,
Yeah.
Odie. You
Yeah.
can make the edit when I
Yeah.
Yeah.
put it. I think it's called functional domain. I can't remember it, but
Yeah.
there's two books on the topic. I'm
I,
sorry for butchering the last one.
that's all right. I think the thing is, as you point out, is the practice. So in my book, I actually devote the first two chapters to talking to people. So I don't have any code in the first two chapters because I think that's the important thing. The rest of the book is actually not as important as the first two chapters. And the first two chapters are all about, how to talk to people and how to document what you're saying to people. So if you want to practice that, I think that the number one thing is to get out of a developer mindset and get into a mindset of like listening to people and trying to become a domain expert yourself, and you need to turn off your coder brain and stop thinking in terms of classes and all this stuff. You just need to think of what are the concepts in the domain, how and I need to learn how the domain works. And that's if you that's something you can practice, and that's actually something most developers are not very good at. So yeah, practicing listening and practicing turning off your coder brain and you know thinking on just on the domain. That would be the first step, I think.
Yeah. The name of the book was Reactive Domain Modeling. It's also
Yeah.
very good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So one is what you mentioned, Scott. For me, was not a trivial task to do. Because I had more than a decade of experience modeling real world systems, right? It it was just very hard to make a paradigm shift. However, now my programming model is, or what I advocate is, um, maybe we shouldn't necessarily try to model real world systems because it's been demonstrated that it's very hard to get that right, especially when it comes to it being sustainable over the lifetime of a system. However, maybe we should consider modeling the rules that that system relies on, right? And that's a lot more. I don't know. It's easier to digest, I think.
I actually can give you an analogy of that, which is like if you're making a map that is 100% accurate with every single detail in it, which is like a one-to-one map, is actually useless. If I want to drive on the freeway, I don't care about where the blades of grass are, right? Like if I'm driving, I want a freeway map or I want a road map. I don't want to see all the detail. I just want what's important to me to use this map is driving or flying. Maybe it's a flying map, or maybe it's a subway map, or whatever it is, or walking map. But whatever it is, it's important to me. A flying map is different from a driving map, and so the map should only have in it what's relevant to the problem you're trying to solve. And so, going back to domain modeling, yeah, you shouldn't try and capture the real world in every single detail because it's really complicated. You capture the most important stuff, and as you say, the most important stuff is probably the business rules and the data flow and the events that trigger things. That's the stuff that's important. A lot of the legal details you shouldn't even bother to capture. It's just not worth it. It's too much effort, and they change all the time. So yeah.
Yeah, another thing, analogy I would add to that, because that map analogy is really, really good. Is if you take the London Metro map,
Yeah.
for
Mm-hmm.
example, it is in no way a reflection of reality, right? It has
Exactly.
all straight lines, whereas in reality there are like bends
That's
and
right.
turns. But to someone who is entering a train, all that detail is absolutely irrelevant. What's more
Exactly.
relevant is the straight line between the points.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't care about the real world. I just care about how do I get from this place to this place, and that's what the map tells you. That's all it tells you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very good.
Scott, do you have any other material that can help people? Do you have any workshops that are archived or video?
I don't have any workshops. I think one of the things that help people actually is getting out of developer stuff and looking at things like anthropology and psychology and architecture and learning about how other because it's not just developers have to do this. I mean, anthropologists, their job is like talking to people and writing down learning what they're saying. Very useful skill. So I think there's non-develop. I think developer technology. There's lots of videos on programming languages and testing and all that stuff. I think to become a better domain modeler, it's more useful to learn about people rather than technology. So, and that's like I say, anthropology, psychology, or human interaction, systems theory, business management theory, understanding how businesses work, all this stuff. That's actually really useful to understand how to write a piece of software. I think much more than how a piece of code works internally.
Yeah. So this has been awesome. Thank
you
you so much.
No, my pleasure.
Yeah, I don't know if you still available to come another time, because we still love to have you. There are so many things we would like to discuss, and there's not enough time to go through them. Like personally, I know I want to discuss microservices, all those details another time. So thank you so much, Scott, for joining us, for being with us. We really appreciate it. And yeah, any other housekeeping, Bismonga?
I remember when I had Scott Wlaschin on my personal channel, he was disturbed that when I said something. I said something to the notion of why do you spend your time dumbing down information to people like me instead of advancing your knowledge and focusing on advanced concepts that maybe are more specific to where you want to go. And you had put me in my place, Scott. You made it clear that you didn't like the term "dumb down," and but I'm still curious. Is there anything that you focus on that's kind of more towards yourself and advancement versus helping people like us?
I like to learn. I mean, I like to learn things for myself. I like learn, category theory or advanced math or something. I find that interesting, but I don't think it's useful. And I mean, and if other people want to learn it, I'm all for that too. And there's lots of people explaining that stuff too.
Okay.
But in terms of software development, I think it should be. There's a lot of beginners. There's a lot of new people coming into software, and I think the more help they can get, the better. In terms of advanced stuff, people once you've got a certain level of experience, you can figure stuff out yourself. Normally, if you're learning something really complicated and you're an experienced programmer, you can normally figure that stuff out. You don't need a lot of hand holding. I mean, it's nice to have a bit of help, but you can read the books and stuff. So I always like to focus on beginner people because and I also find it very satisfying because it's nice when someone says, they found one of my talks useful or something. That makes me feel good, So that's why I focus on beginners more than. But I mean, I have done some Monad talks. I've done some advanced stuff. I did a talk on TLA plus and model checking, which is kind of advanced for most people, I think. It had a lot of math in it, and so yeah, I've done a few things. But yeah, in general, I like teaching people. I get a kick out of it. That's one of my things I enjoy.
Yeah, it's something that made me a big fan of yours as well. Also, in my own experience too, I think one of the things I've also learned too is when you understand something, you don't necessarily know why you understand it until you try to explain it to someone else.
Exactly.
And then you start to have a deeper understanding of it because you start to challenge your assumptions as to what you think you understand, especially when they ask stupid questions in quote, and all of a sudden you ask yourself, why is this question stupid? Maybe there is something about the way this problem domain works, or maybe there is some merit to what they are asking, or stuff like that. So yeah, I've also seen. So one of the point I'm getting at is, if you really want to learn something, teach it.
Absolutely, I 100% agree, and that's one of the reasons I started my blog. I thought if I want to learn this thing, if I write down what I've learned, it forces me to. If I'm trying to explain it to other people, it really forces you to learn things really well. So absolutely, I recommend anyone listening to this, if you want to learn something, write a blog about it or do something, because that really forces you to learn it really well. Absolutely, 100% agree to that.
Yeah, so that's it. If you enjoyed this discussion, please give us a comment. Let us know what you think.
We're at like approximately 335 subscribers. Call to action, help us to get to 400. If you found this episode valuable, then yeah, subscribe. That's it.
All right.